Before another thought pulls your attention away, linger here for a moment, because something quietly meaningful has been unfolding where you cannot yet see it. There is a conversation connected to your name, and what makes it unusual is not that someone is talking about you. People talk every day. What makes this different is that the person who carries feelings for you has been listening. Listening carefully. Listening more than they admit. And the voices reaching them belong to two friends whose opinions could not be more different. One of them notices details. The other notices possibilities. One studies what is already visible. The other imagines what might happen next. And somehow, without realizing it, they have both become part of a story that is slowly circling back toward you. What is fascinating is that neither friend sees you in exactly the same way. The first friend is cautious. Observant. The kind of person who watches quietly before speaking. They notice the things most people miss. The way you handle disappointment without making it everyone's burden. The way you continue moving forward even when recognition arrives late. The way your presence changes the atmosphere of a room without demanding attention. This friend has said things about you that surprised the person you love. Not because the words were dramatic. Because they were accurate. And accuracy has a strange power. When someone describes you correctly, it becomes difficult to ignore what they are saying. Meanwhile, the second friend carries a completely different energy. This friend sees connections. Patterns. Potential. Where others see ordinary moments, they see possibilities hiding beneath the surface. And lately, they have been asking questions. Interesting questions. Questions that linger long after conversations end. Questions like, what if you're overlooking something important? What if this connection matters more than you think? What if the person you're thinking about has been part of the answer all along? The person you love rarely responds immediately when these questions appear. But that silence says more than words. Because some questions are not ignored. They are carried. Held. Revisited later when nobody else is around. And lately, that is exactly what has been happening. There have been moments when your name appeared unexpectedly. Moments when a simple conversation turned into something deeper. Moments when both friends found themselves discussing you longer than anyone planned. Not because they were trying to interfere. Not because they were trying to create a story. But because something about you kept returning to the conversation. Like a song that quietly repeats in the background until everyone realizes they have been listening to it all along. Do not skip. Something important is waiting for you inside this realization. The person you care about has heard praise about you. But they have also heard caution. And strangely enough, both have mattered. Because admiration alone can create fantasy. Caution alone can create distance. Yet when both exist together, something more balanced begins to form. Something real. The cautious friend once pointed out a quality in you that made the room unexpectedly quiet. Not because it was shocking. Because it explained something everyone had felt but nobody had said aloud. They spoke about your resilience. Not the obvious kind. The quieter kind. The resilience that appears when life does not follow your preferred timeline. The resilience that remains when plans change. The resilience that continues choosing hope without needing applause. And when those words were spoken, the person you love became unusually thoughtful. Because suddenly they were not just seeing you through their own perspective. They were seeing you through another set of eyes. Sometimes that changes everything. Yet the second friend had another perspective entirely. This friend believes that certain people arrive in our lives carrying lessons, growth, and unexpected blessings. Not perfect people. Not magical people. Simply people whose presence leaves a lasting mark. And one evening, after a conversation that seemed ordinary at first, this friend asked something nobody expected. They asked whether the person you love ever felt different after speaking with you. Not happier. Not sadder. Different. The question lingered. Because the answer was immediate. And immediate answers often reveal hidden truths. The person you love admitted that something shifts whenever you cross their thoughts. A certain stillness. A certain curiosity. A certain feeling that there is more to understand. More to discover. More to learn. And ever since that admission, the conversations have changed. Subtly. Quietly. But noticeably. Now the two friends watch with greater interest. Not because they are controlling anything. Because they are witnessing something. They see the way your name changes expressions. They notice the pause before answers. They notice how certain topics naturally lead back to you. And although they disagree about many things, they have begun agreeing on one unexpected point. You are not easily forgotten. That realization arrived gradually. Nobody announced it. Nobody planned it. It simply became obvious. And sometimes the truths that matter most arrive exactly that way. Without noise. Without spectacle. Without warning. A strange thing happens when someone becomes difficult to forget. People begin paying attention to why. What is it about this person? What remains after conversations end? What continues echoing after the day is over? The two friends have been searching for those answers in different ways. One through observation. The other through intuition. And somewhere between those two approaches, a picture has begun forming. A picture that is still incomplete. A picture that nobody fully understands yet. But a picture that grows clearer with every passing conversation. Stay till the end. Because there is one detail neither friend expected. The person you love has not corrected them. Not once. When your name appears, they listen. When questions arise, they answer. When observations are shared, they consider them. And when conversations drift toward you unexpectedly, they remain present instead of changing the subject. That matters more than it seems. Because attention is valuable. People protect it carefully. They do not continue giving it to subjects that mean nothing. Yet here you are. Still present. Still appearing. Still becoming part of discussions that nobody planned to have. And tonight, as another conversation quietly approaches, something unusual is beginning to happen. The cautious friend is preparing to reveal an observation they have kept to themselves. The optimistic friend is preparing to ask a question nobody has dared ask before. The person you love has no idea that both moments are approaching. But they are. And when those words are finally spoken, the atmosphere surrounding your name may change in a way none of them expect. For now, all you need to know is this. Your story is being understood from angles you cannot see. Your presence is being noticed in ways you never intended. And somewhere beyond your awareness, two very different voices are slowly helping someone recognize something they may have overlooked for far too long. The most interesting part? Neither friend realizes that the next conversation could reveal far more than either of them planned. And that conversation is closer than anyone thinks. A quiet shift is already underway, though nobody in that circle has fully recognized it yet. The evening seemed ordinary when it began. There were familiar voices, familiar surroundings, and the kind of conversation that drifts naturally from one subject to another. Yet beneath the surface, something felt different. Not dramatic. Not obvious. Just different enough to be noticed by those who pay attention to the spaces between words. The cautious friend was the first to sense it. They had been watching for a long time. Not watching you directly. Watching the person who cares about you. Watching the subtle reactions that appeared whenever your name surfaced unexpectedly. And on this particular evening, they decided to say something they had never said before. The room wasn't silent. The conversation wasn't serious. Yet somehow their words landed with unusual weight. They said that people often spend years searching for qualities they already recognize when they meet someone special. The statement seemed simple. Almost casual. But it immediately changed the atmosphere. Because everyone knew exactly who they were talking about. Nobody needed clarification. Nobody asked for names. The meaning was already understood. For a moment, the person you love looked away. Not out of discomfort. Not out of confusion. But because some observations arrive so accurately that they leave no room for easy responses. And then something unexpected happened. The second friend smiled. Not because they disagreed. Because they had been thinking something similar for weeks. Only they planned to say it differently. This friend leaned forward slightly and asked a question that seemed harmless on the surface. What do you think about most after talking about them? A simple question. Yet it carried surprising depth. Because it didn't ask what they liked. It didn't ask what they admired. It asked what remained. What stayed behind after conversations ended. What continued echoing when everything became quiet again. The answer did not arrive immediately. And that delay told its own story. Because when people search carefully for an answer, it usually means they are trying to describe something real. Eventually, they spoke. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just honestly. They admitted that whenever they thought about you, they found themselves wondering what your future might look like. The room became unusually still. Not because the answer was shocking. Because it revealed something deeper than anyone expected. People think about many things. Memories. Experiences. Conversations. But when someone begins imagining another person's future, it often means that person has become part of their emotional landscape. Part of the way they see tomorrow. And neither friend missed the significance of that. The cautious friend exchanged a glance with the optimistic one. For the first time in a long while, they seemed to agree completely. Something meaningful was unfolding. Not because anyone was forcing it. Not because anyone was planning it. Because certain truths eventually reveal themselves when enough time passes. What nobody mentioned aloud was how often your name had appeared recently. Not by accident. Not through effort. Naturally. Effortlessly. Almost as though every road somehow found its way back to the same destination. One conversation led there. Then another. Then another. Until even the person you love began noticing the pattern. And patterns are difficult to ignore. Especially when they continue repeating themselves. The optimistic friend eventually shared an observation they had been keeping private. They said that some people create excitement. Some people create comfort. And very rarely, someone creates both. The moment those words entered the room, something shifted again. Because nobody laughed. Nobody dismissed it. Nobody changed the subject. Instead, everyone became thoughtful. The person you love most of all. You see, excitement can be temporary. Comfort can become ordinary. But when both exist together, something unique begins to form. A connection that feels familiar and intriguing at the same time. A connection that invites curiosity instead of exhausting it. And deep down, they knew exactly why those words felt important. Because they reminded them of you. Something important is waiting for you. Not in a dramatic revelation. Not in a sudden announcement. But in understanding how these conversations are gradually reshaping the way someone sees you. Every observation adds another piece. Every question reveals another layer. Every discussion uncovers something previously unnoticed. And the most fascinating part is that none of this was planned. Nobody gathered with the intention of analyzing feelings. Nobody created an agenda. Nobody expected your name to become the center of so many meaningful conversations. Yet it happened anyway. That alone says something. Because genuine significance rarely needs to be forced. It emerges naturally. Slowly. Quietly. Like dawn appearing long before anyone notices the sky changing. As the evening continued, the conversation moved elsewhere. Different topics. Different stories. Different laughter. But something remained beneath it all. An unfinished thought. An unanswered question. The kind that refuses to disappear. Eventually, the cautious friend spoke once more. This time their voice carried unusual certainty. They said that sometimes people become so focused on finding certainty that they overlook consistency. The room grew thoughtful again. Because consistency is often more revealing. Anyone can create a memorable moment. Anyone can say the right thing once. But consistency tells a deeper story. And according to this friend, every time they observed the situation, one thing remained consistent. Your impact. Your presence. Your ability to remain relevant long after conversations ended. The person you love didn't argue. Didn't interrupt. Didn't dismiss the observation. They simply listened. And that silence carried more meaning than 1,000 explanations. Because silence often protects the truths we are not yet ready to explain. Meanwhile, the optimistic friend was becoming increasingly curious. There was one question they still hadn't asked. One question they had been carrying for days. Perhaps weeks. A question that seemed simple but had the power to change everything. They almost asked it. Then stopped. Not because they were afraid. Because timing matters. Some questions deserve the right moment. And deep inside, they felt that moment approaching. Closer than anyone realized. Closer than the person you love realized. Closer than even you would expect. As the gathering finally began winding down, everyone started preparing to leave. The conversation appeared finished. The evening appeared complete. Yet just before the last goodbye, something happened that nobody anticipated. The optimistic friend quietly pulled the person you love aside. Away from the group. Away from the noise. Away from the distractions. And there, in a conversation nobody else heard, they finally asked the question they had been holding back. The response came so quickly that it caught them completely off guard. In fact, the answer revealed something neither friend had expected to hear. Something that would completely change the conversations moving forward. And once that truth begins circulating between them, your name will never be discussed in quite the same way again. That moment is waiting just ahead. And neither of them realizes how much it is about to reveal. The night had almost ended when the question finally escaped into the quiet air between them. There was no audience. No group discussion. No friendly laughter filling the background. Just two people standing in a moment that felt strangely important without knowing exactly why. The optimistic friend looked at the person you love and asked something they had been carrying for longer than anyone realized. Not, do you like them? Not, are you thinking about them? Not even, what do you want to happen? The question was different. It reached deeper. It slipped past easy answers. They simply asked, what would you miss if they suddenly disappeared from your life completely? For a brief second, there was silence. Not the awkward kind. The honest kind. The kind that appears when a question lands directly on a truth someone has been avoiding. And then something unexpected happened. The person you love answered immediately. Too quickly to invent something. Too naturally to hide anything. They didn't mention specific conversations. They didn't mention memories. They didn't mention moments. Instead, they said they would miss how life felt when you were part of it. The friend froze. Because that answer carried more meaning than either of them expected. People often miss events. Experiences. Messages. But missing how life feels around someone is something entirely different. That realization followed them home. It followed them into the next day. And strangely enough, it followed both friends as well. Because once certain words are spoken aloud, they cannot be unheard. The cautious friend learned about the conversation later. At first, they said very little. They simply listened. Absorbed every detail. Thought carefully. Then they smiled. A quiet smile. The kind that appears when something finally makes sense. Because for weeks they had been observing signs that seemed disconnected. Small reactions. Small pauses. Small shifts in energy whenever your name appeared. Individually, none of them seemed significant. Together, however, they formed a picture. A picture that was becoming harder and harder to ignore. Meanwhile, the person you love was beginning to experience something unusual. They started noticing how often thoughts about you appeared during completely unrelated moments. Not dramatic thoughts. Not overwhelming thoughts. Just steady ones. Persistent ones. Thoughts that arrived without invitation. A song would remind them of something. A place would trigger a memory. A random conversation would unexpectedly connect back to you. And each time it happened, they found themselves pausing for a little longer than before. Trying to understand why. Trying to understand what it meant. Trying to understand why your presence seemed to remain even when you weren't there. The interesting thing is that neither friend pushed them. Neither friend tried to convince them of anything. In fact, the more they observed, the less they felt the need to interfere. Because some realizations cannot be handed to someone. They must be discovered. And discovery was already happening. Slowly. Quietly. Naturally. Like sunlight gradually filling a room before anyone notices the darkness has disappeared. Days passed. Then another conversation arrived. A completely different setting. A completely different topic. Yet somehow, once again, your name found its way into the discussion. At this point, nobody was surprised anymore. The pattern had become impossible to ignore. The cautious friend decided to test something. Not maliciously. Not manipulatively. Simply out of curiosity. They mentioned several people during the conversation. Different names. Different stories. Different situations. The person you love responded politely to all of them. But when your name appeared, everything changed. Not dramatically. Subtly. The posture shifted. The attention sharpened. The conversation became more engaged. More present. More alive. It lasted only seconds. Yet seconds can reveal more than hours. And both friends noticed. Every single detail. What surprised them most wasn't the reaction itself. It was how effortless it appeared. Nothing was forced. Nothing was exaggerated. It simply happened. As naturally as breathing. And suddenly, the cautious friend understood something. For all their analysis. For all their observations. They had been asking the wrong question. The question was never whether you mattered. That answer had already become obvious. The real question was how much. And that answer was still unfolding. Something important is waiting for you. Because what happened next changed the direction of everything. A few evenings later, the friends gathered again. The conversation moved through familiar territory. Stories. Dreams. Plans. The usual rhythm of people sharing pieces of their lives. Then someone asked a harmless question. A simple question that nobody thought twice about. What kind of person leaves the biggest impact on you? Everyone offered answers. Different perspectives. Different opinions. Different experiences. The cautious friend spoke. Then the optimistic friend. Then everyone else. Eventually, the question reached the person you love. And the answer that followed left the room unusually quiet. They said the people who leave the biggest impact are the ones who make you feel understood without constantly needing explanations. The words hung there. Unmoving. Heavy with meaning. Because everyone immediately thought the same thing. Everyone. Even though nobody said it aloud. And once again, your name lingered silently between them. Unspoken. Yet somehow present. The optimistic friend noticed it first. That strange silence. That shared understanding. That invisible connection between the answer and the person everyone was thinking about. It was becoming almost impossible to separate the two. Not because anyone wanted to. Because the connection kept forming naturally. Again and again. The person you love didn't seem fully aware of how transparent certain feelings had become. Or perhaps they were aware. Perhaps they simply weren't ready to say everything aloud yet. That possibility crossed both friends' minds more than once. Because sometimes people arrive at an understanding long before they find the words to describe it. And perhaps that was exactly what was happening. Perhaps they were standing on the edge of a realization that had been growing quietly for months. A realization neither friend could create. A realization nobody could rush. A realization that belonged entirely to them. And then, just when everything seemed to be settling into place, another unexpected detail emerged. A detail neither friend knew. A detail the person you love had kept completely private. When it finally comes to light, it will explain why your name keeps returning. Why certain conversations feel different. Why every discussion somehow circles back to you. And why both friends are beginning to believe there is far more happening beneath the surface than anyone originally imagined. That hidden detail has remained untouched for a long time. But not for much longer. Because someone is getting closer to discovering it. And once they do, the conversations about you will enter an entirely new chapter. A realization rarely arrives all at once. More often, it gathers quietly in the background, collecting pieces of evidence until one ordinary moment suddenly feels impossible to ignore. That is exactly where things were beginning to lead. The hidden detail neither friend knew was still protected behind silence, but silence has a way of growing thinner when enough questions begin surrounding it. It happened on an afternoon that seemed completely ordinary. No important occasion. No special event. Nothing that would have suggested a turning point was approaching. Yet those are often the moments that matter most. The person you love was spending time with the cautious friend when a conversation unexpectedly drifted toward future plans. Not grand plans. Not life-changing decisions. Just the small kind of thoughts people share when they feel comfortable. Places they hope to visit. Experiences they hope to have. Goals they hope to reach. The conversation moved naturally until the cautious friend noticed something unusual. Every future scenario seemed to contain a familiar shadow. Not a person standing clearly in the picture. More like a presence woven quietly into the edges of it. At first, they thought they were imagining it. But the pattern continued. Again. And again. And again. Finally, curiosity won. The cautious friend paused and asked a question. What role do they play in all of this? The person you love looked genuinely surprised. Almost as if they hadn't realized what they had been revealing. For a moment, they didn't answer. Not because they were avoiding the question. Because they were examining it. Looking at it from every angle. Trying to determine whether the observation was actually true. And deep inside, they discovered something that caught them off guard. It was true. Far more true than they expected. Because somewhere along the way, without making a conscious decision, they had started including you in thoughts about tomorrow. Not directly. Not intentionally. But naturally. The way someone becomes part of a landscape you've grown accustomed to seeing. The way certain stars become part of the night sky until you can no longer imagine the view without them. The cautious friend didn't push further. They didn't need to. The answer had already revealed enough. Later that evening, they shared the conversation with the optimistic friend. The reaction was immediate. Not surprise. Validation. Because the optimistic friend had suspected something similar for weeks. There had been clues. Small clues. Almost invisible clues. The kind most people overlook. A change in tone. An unexpected smile. The way attention sharpened whenever your name entered a conversation. The way certain discussions lingered longer than necessary. Individually, they meant very little. Together, however, they formed a story. And that story was becoming clearer with every passing day. Yet the most revealing moment was still ahead. Something important is waiting for you. Because neither friend knew about the notebook. Not an actual secret journal filled with dramatic confessions. Nothing like that. Just a place where occasional thoughts were written down. Ideas. Observations. Questions. Moments worth remembering. The kind of things people write when they're trying to understand themselves. One evening, while looking back through older pages, the person you love noticed something startling. Your name appeared more often than expected. Not intentionally. Not because they were trying to write about you. It had simply happened. There you were in observations. There you were in reflections. There you were hidden inside stories about ordinary days. The discovery was strangely emotional. Because for the first time, they saw evidence of something that had been developing quietly over time. Something steady. Something genuine. Something impossible to blame on a single moment. And once that realization appeared, it became difficult to ignore. They began looking back differently. Re-examining conversations. Re-examining memories. Re-examining countless moments they had previously considered insignificant. Suddenly, those moments felt connected. Like pieces of a puzzle that had been scattered across time. The optimistic friend noticed another shift shortly afterward. The person you love had started asking more questions. Not questions about you specifically. Questions about connection. About timing. About why certain people seem to arrive exactly when they are needed. Questions people usually ask when they are trying to understand feelings that are becoming harder to dismiss. The friend recognized it immediately. Not because they had all the answers. Because they had seen this process before. The gradual movement from curiosity to clarity. The slow transition from wondering to understanding. And perhaps most importantly, the realization that some people leave a deeper impression than we originally admit. Days continued passing. Conversations continued unfolding. And with each one, the two friends became increasingly fascinated by something neither had anticipated. The person you love was no longer just listening when your name appeared. They were contributing. Adding observations. Sharing thoughts. Offering details. Not because anyone asked them to. Because they wanted to. That difference mattered a great deal. Because genuine interest does not require encouragement. It creates its own momentum. And momentum was beginning to build. The cautious friend eventually made an observation that stayed with everyone. They said that sometimes the most important person in a story is not the one who speaks the loudest. It's the one whose presence keeps returning, no matter how many chapters pass. The room became thoughtful. Because everyone knew exactly who they were talking about. No names were necessary. No explanations were needed. The meaning was already understood. The person you love didn't argue. Didn't redirect the conversation. Didn't laugh it away. Instead, they simply smiled. A small smile. A quiet smile. But one that revealed far more than words. The optimistic friend noticed it immediately. And in that moment, they became convinced of something. The conversations about you were no longer creating a realization. They were revealing one that already existed. A realization that had been growing silently beneath the surface for much longer than anyone realized. And yet, there was still one unanswered question. One final mystery both friends continued discussing whenever they were alone. Neither wondered whether you mattered anymore. That question had already been answered. Neither wondered whether your presence was significant. That answer had become obvious too. The question now was different. Much deeper. Much more personal. They wanted to know whether you understood any of this. Whether you had any idea how often your name appeared. How frequently your presence influenced conversations. How naturally you had become part of someone's thoughts about the future. Because from their perspective, the most surprising part of the entire story wasn't what the person you love felt. It was the possibility that you might not fully realize the impact you've already had. And very soon, something is going to happen that brings that hidden impact into clearer focus than ever before. A conversation is approaching. A conversation neither friend planned. A conversation the person you love never expected to have. And during that conversation, a single observation will be shared that changes the way everyone sees the story. When those words are finally spoken, the truth that has been quietly forming behind every discussion will no longer feel like scattered pieces. For the first time, it will begin to look like a complete picture. And that picture is closer than anyone thinks.